Hi everyone, here's the Book Chemist once again. After reading The Adventures of Augie March by Saul Bellow, I was skeptical whether Buddenbrooks was really the best book to follow that up with. As I talked about in my review, I found Augie March a very difficult book, not in terms of following the intricacies of the plot or in terms of opaque writing. It's quite accessible on that front, more in terms of finding it a very dense novel where I struggle to understand quite why I should care about the book, and in simpler terms, how to have fun with it and have a good experience of it. My experience of Mann before Buddenbrooks was quite limited. I read Dr. Faustus several years ago and found it as fascinating as it was cryptic, and I also read Death in Venice, which in all honesty I didn't really like very much. I was afraid that Buddenbrooks would be a difficult, complicated, slow novel, and that I would have too much of a hard time with it after another novel that I already struggle with. So I decided to sit down with it, read 50, 100 pages and be like, okay Thomas, just dazzle me. If you convince me, I'll stick with it. Buddenbrooks follows the life of a German merchant family across the 19th century. As the narrative opens, it is 1835 and the family has just purchased a new mansion in Lübeck, in their hometown, just across the street, or anyway very close to St. Mary's Church. Google it, it's quite an impressive little building. And they're throwing a housewarming party. They're throwing a big dinner, a big celebration to celebrate the purchase of this new family house. And Mann is masterful in portraying, in giving you just a couple of details, a couple of features about all of the different characters that take part in this dinner, so that you're able to follow them, even though there are so many of them, and without turning them into caricatures in any way. The old patriarch, whom we'll call Grandpa Buddenbrook, is quite a practical man who doesn't really mind making fun of religion and other high topics. His son, the consul Buddenbrooks, is instead quite a pious, quite a serious man. We get a sense that his relationship with the Frau Consul, with his wife, might not be motivated by the most blinding passion in the history of love. It might be a relationship of convenience, but still they are a good couple in their way. They have a good partnership in this somewhat sad and somewhat mechanical, mercantilistic way. And then you also meet their children, Thomas, Christian and Anthony, or Tony, who'll be the protagonists of much of the book. The way they laugh at specific jokes, their attitude when higher topics are discussed, their attitude on matters of trade and commerce, whether they approve of ruthless new measures that will make it easier to, well, increase their fortune at the expense maybe of the wealth of their friends. The way they relate to all of these things tells you some key details about these characters that allow you to place them in the vast canopy of the novel. Even though you're introduced to dozens of people, and Buddenbrooks is a choral novel if I've ever read one, you're always able to keep track of them quite easily. Mann always makes sure that you are. This wonderful gift that my dear Thomas has is of great help to the novel, because the narrative pace of Buddenbrooks, the way the story evolves, is extremely challenging, not on the reader, but on the writer himself. Very often the novel, which is built around quite short chapters, jumps years ahead in the course of the 20th century. Many of those people you meet at that housewarming party do not even survive the first 50 pages, really. Sometimes the novel will slow down and, say, a fateful summer or even just a single dinner party will stretch across several chapters, but at other times an entire decade might pass within just a couple of pages. And this is an extremely difficult trick to pull off for a writer, because it's really difficult to keep the reader engaged when you play with the narrative time so freely. What happens to me a lot in books that pull these kind of tricks is that I'm like, oh, well, hold on, I don't really want to read about events 10 years in the future. I want to read more about the characters that I became fond of, about these characters as young people, about, well, what happens after that summer? Is that, well, that love story at the seaside resort, is it over? Is it all gone now? These never happened to me in the course of Buddenbrooks. The novel's narrative pace is at once effortlessly portrayed and at the same time clearly hides a lot of hard work. This is going to sound like a very easy metaphor, but it reminded me a lot of those cutesy/creepy German clocks where all the dancing figures come out at the stroke of an hour and you get a bit of a carry-on and you get all of these mechanical figures dancing around. Even more astonishing than this idea that the novel can jump across time very freely and then slow down and then jump again. Even more astonishing than this is the fact that the title of protagonist of the novel shifts significantly as the book progresses. At first, Consul Buddenbrook is possibly the real protagonist, but very soon Tony takes on that role, and then it's Thomas, then Tony again, and so on and so forth. But I never experienced a sense of discombobulation, that sense of confusion you sometimes get in these sorts of books, where it becomes hard to care about all of these characters equally. The reason why it is so easy to care about all of them is that Mann is masterful at giving each of them their individual problems and their individual demons to fight with, and making the struggle of their family, the struggle to stay afloat in the changing historical situation of Germany in the 19th century, the struggle not just to stay afloat but to keep expanding, to keep increasing the family prestige and the family wealth, most notably, the struggle to suppress their own wishes and desires in the name of the family's, well, success. All of these dynamics make the plight of all these different characters a plight that is very often in opposition to one another. A character's happiness is very often, this character's happiness is clearly goes entirely against the interests of the family. Because all of this is so interesting and so compelling, Mann is able to present the evolution of the different characters at whatever point in the novel without really disrupting the narrative. So you want to tell me more about Thomas or Christian? Why not? I'm all ears. The tension between these two characters, between Thomas, who clearly has a sensitive side but suppresses it all his life because he wants to be the stand-up, honorable, successful merchant that his father expected him to be, whereas Christian clearly cannot possibly do a honest day's work. He is just interested in reveling and partying and going to the theater and going to the club. He is also obsessed by these rather morbid manias and is a huge hypochondriac too, and he is clearly troubled by the sense that he has, that he is not up to the standards that his family expects of him. The tension between these two characters that are at once opposite and yet so quite similar in a way, it builds up in the course of the novel and explodes time and again, and every time it explodes, the blast from these quarrels is felt as stronger, impacts the lives of the other characters more significantly, and it all builds up wonderfully to the final chapters of the novel. Toni Buddenbrook is a novel unto herself, possibly the most interesting character in a novel peopled by amazing, unforgettable characters. She is clearly cruel and self-absorbed and self-entitled and very much of an asshole, really, but at the same time she's also ready to sustain all sorts of sacrifices in the name of her family's success. She accepts all forms of abuse and oppression just because that's what's expected of her. And the way Mann portrays her speech patterns, her thought processes, really shows you how her evolution from a spoiled child, to an entitled young woman, to a woman who's aware of the troubles she's had and of the suffering she had to withstand, eventually leading her back to a sort of a second childhood, where she almost reverts back to her old, spoiled, self-absorbed self. All of that is portrayed majestically, in a way that is very easy. It's very easy to track the evolution of Tony as a character, because it emerges from the events of the novel in a very natural way that is a pleasure to experience, albeit a terrible pleasure. You do suffer with Tony as you read about the next catastrophe that befalls her, and even though she is in many ways a terrible person to so many people around her, she's so entitled, she's so stuck up, you end up suffering alongside her. That's part of the experience, the empathic nature of getting to know this character and getting to rejoice and suffer with them. In fact, Buddenbrook's characters are among the most well-rounded and fully human I've ever encountered. As I mentioned before, none of them is a caricature. All of them are terrible people in a way, because they are entitled, rich people at a time of great strife, at a time of great economic difficulties for large parts of the population. They are arrogant and they are proud, and yet in their own way they feel like they are a great contribution to the community. They feel like what they do, the work they provide to the working classes of Lübeck, the charity they do, the religious missions that the Frau Consul takes upon her to continue, the religious readings she organizes around her house, all of these things contribute to their own sense of themselves as pretty upstanding, very moral characters. And the contradictions implied there, both in social terms and in personal terms, in the fact that all of these characters are aware that these struggles they've imposed on themselves to be the richest and the most influential and the most important family in Lübeck is dooming them all to misery. All of these tensions are present into the novel. It's actually impossible to fully distinguish between the social aspect of it, the fact that the family is constantly besieged by these more successful families trying to basically push them out of business, and the personal side of it all. It's also very deeply intertwined. Just as Tony is at once a really strong character and a really childish one, just as Christian is at once oblivious to anybody else around him and can't really conceive of anybody else's problems except his own, but at the same time is deeply ashamed because of this and because of his incapacity to be as efficient and as productive as his brother Thomas. All of the characters in the books are full of contradictions, are full of those paradoxes that humans share, that all humans share, that are part of the human experience and of human life, and that truly great novels can cast a light on. The Consul Buddenbrook, such an important character in the early part of the novel, in many ways is among the most upstanding, most moral characters in the book. But at the same time, he shows clearly no sort of empathy for the rebellions and the revolutions of 48. With his own daughter, he acts quite cruelly and tyrannically when it comes to marrying her off to ensure the success of the family's fortune. In accommodating the endless varieties of the human experience, Buddenbrooks is a true literary masterpiece. It is narrative perfection. And I thought it couldn't get any better, and then I stumbled upon the final few chapters. Very close to the end of the book, you follow Hanno Buddenbrook, Thomas' son, throughout a normal and apparently average day at the age of 15. By now, most of the novel's protagonists have stepped off the stage for one reason or another, and you're quite close to the end of the book. And you follow Hanno as he goes to school, you get to meet his classmates, you get to meet his friends, his teachers, you get to experience that he's a very sensitive kid, he's obsessed with music, which he finds a truly beautiful and uplifting pursuit, fully separated from the contradictions and the difficulties of life. He has a deep sense of injustice. He is not really interested in scholarly or business pursuits. And as I read about Hanno's day, I was getting a bit worried, because I'm like, well, I could see that the book was about to end, and I'm like, Thomas, you're like 10 pages away from the end. Why are you telling me all this? can't possibly develop this character any longer, you know? Shouldn't you be wrapping things up? But then at the end of this average school day, which is interesting and includes a couple of twists, you can always rely on twists and other narrative tricks to keep you engaged throughout Buddenbrooks. At the end of this day, at the end of this long chapter, you get the single line, "This was one day in the life of little John." And that simply blew me away. That commitment to talk about the lives of these characters, to document the existence of these imaginary people in order to talk and document and discuss existence and reality and the life we live at different times across history, the different experiences that we are exposed to and the way they change us, this determination to talk about existence that is at the heart of great literature and animates Buddenbrooks so strongly, is never as perceivable in the book as in that line. What I got out of it, what I got out of this chapter, was this determination to preserve a day in the life of little John, even though maybe that leads nowhere in particular in the course of the novel, even though maybe his life will not achieve the same sort of greatness that was his great-grandfather's or his grandfather's, even though maybe he is not going to become a captain of industry or an important figure in the life of Lubeck, his life still deserved to be preserved in this long narrative passage. Buddenbrooks beautifully intertwines the lives of its characters with the economic life of the time. It's clearly, as a novel, it is clearly very, very aware that the great shifts in history and nations and the dynamics of power are all tied to the market and the economy, to the exchange of goods and money, and the scarcity or abundance of them. It's not a novel that lingers too much, for all that these are central decades in the evolution of Germany, with the revolutions that crossed Europe, with the eventual process of unification for the country. The novel doesn't really stress that too much. It's more interested in showing how those events influence the life of this family, how they made the fortune of some people but doomed others to misery. And in this awareness, the novel is also determined to condemn the cruelty of the market, of market capitalism, which is eventually, it's defined as the force that forced the Buddenbrooks, force this family to be exploitative, to be ruthless in their business, to be tremendously cruel in their competitiveness with other families, and eventually doom them for good. If the novel subtitle is Decline of a Family, you can be sure that that subtitle will be fulfilled before the end of the book. You can rest assured that some of these people will die in horrible ways. There's an incredibly painful scene about a tooth removal that goes wrong that is as impactful as anything you can read in a Chuck Palahniuk novel or whatnot. I'm always skeptical when people mention, the desire to live in a different time, to travel back to the 1920s or the 19th century or whatnot. If only for dentistry, I'm very happy I live in this time in history. It is, once more, a perfect novel. The fact that Thomas Mann wrote it at 26 is simply unfair. I was eating crayons when I was 26. I just can't wrap my head around it. What did you think of Buddenbrooks? What did you think of the novel? Did you enjoy it as much? Do you consider it as much of a literary gem? Did you struggle with it? I truly look forward to discussing the book with you in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching the review, and thank you to my patrons for supporting it and supporting the channel. Their names should be flashing at the bottom of the screen. If you like my reviews and you'd like to support what I do, please visit my Patreon page, and thank you once more for watching. Bye, people.